This is a podcast from RadioMoLI, a digital radio station for Irish literature, broadcasting from MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, located on Dublin's St Stephen's Green. For more from RadioMoLI and the Museum of Literature Ireland, visit radio.moli.ie. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that buying MoLI membership for yourself, your family or a friend is the best way to support the museum and its programming. Head over to moli.ie/membership to sign up. Thank you for listening.
UCD has a particular focus on equality, diversity and inclusion. So we've come together with MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, in this project called Past, Present and Pride. It's a way for us to work with, to interview, to hear the voices of LGBTI writers, Irish writers and perhaps some international writers, a way to give voice to the LGBTI experience, to advance issues of diversity, inclusion and equality. I'm Paul Dalton. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in UCD and I also work in St Vincent's Hospital in Allen Park. I'm delighted to say our guest today is Colm Tóibín, a man known to many. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Colm to MoLI and indeed to Past, Present and Pride. So, Colm Tóibín, novelist, journalist, poet, critic, professor of humanities at Columbia University, chancellor of the University of Liverpool. Welcome to MoLI. Welcome to Newman House, the foundation house of UCD, your alma mater. Welcome to this project, Past, Present and Pride, an initiative with equality, diversity and inclusion at UCD. And welcome back to Dublin and to the world post-quarantine, because I think you came back from LA recently and you've been in quarantine. What's it like being out in the world again?
Well, there's no real world at the moment, is there? So we're all still indoors and it's all still pretty dull. It's good. I mean, if you're a writer, it's good. If you're a wedding planner, it's not.
It's a disaster, yeah. You'd spent some time in LA before coming back to Dublin.
I was in New York and it was very clear from the week before, this is March, that something really bad was coming towards New York. Everyone was aware of it and everyone was aware that there was a row going on between de Blasio, the mayor, and Andrew Cuomo, the governor, and between Andrew Cuomo and Trump, and that we were all being caught in this snare that they had established, these white guys had established. And luckily in the end, Cuomo prevailed, but it took him a very long time. So on the 10th of March, I fled. I just went to the airport and I fled. I didn't, it was spring break at Columbia, and it was clear anyway that we were not going to go. I mean, it was pretty clear to me we were not going to go back. So I went to LA and where my partner lives, and we had a nice time and we settled down for 6 months. We only saw each other. And I did a lot of work. Yeah, you did a lot of work. Yeah.
Colm, you were born in Enniscorthy in County Wexford in 1955, the setting for many of your novels. You've said that as a child that you watched a lot and that sometimes it was the only thing you did was to watch. What were you watching as a child?
Adults.
Yeah.
And just listening, watching, trying to make sense of things.
Yeah. And watching as a child and as opposed to kind of being in the middle of things,
I have that feeling, that I was more content watching. But it was pretty normal as well. I mean, I played tennis and I did everything else. It wasn't. I mean, I wasn't one of those sort of isolated, messed up kids that everyone worries about. It wasn't like that.
Yeah. But there was a sense of some kind of internal world, kind of watching, making sense.
I have a funny memory, and I can remember things very clearly, and I could even then, if someone said something, I'd remember what they had said, and I'd remember what they said previously, and that's just sort of, I suppose, noticing.
Yeah. I understand that you didn't read until you were almost 9. Yeah. Well, how was that, or what happened?
I just didn't, and it was fine because if a comic book came, my sister read it for me, but she often turned the pages too quickly. But nonetheless, she did that for me, and I just didn't. It just didn't connect. I mean, I just didn't see it, and I just didn't.
Was that a concern for people around you? Do you think?
Because you see, my father was a teacher, and the family was all about education, and the idea of being stupid, was not something that the family was ready to entertain. Really,
and was that a kind of he's stupid, he's
slow. Wouldn't have used stupid, but I did overhear her saying, my mother, to someone, Colm is the one who's the others are very good academic, well, she wouldn't have said academically, but very good at school and stuff. Colm is the one that really is, and teachers would have said to her, he's just not listening, he's not paying any attention, he's not able to do anything.
Yeah.
The fool of the family.
Yeah, I'm sure there are many parents who'd be very pleased to hear that. We have such expectations, don't we, on children to do certain things at the right time.
Yeah, academically.
Yeah. I was reminded of it's Donal, isn't it, in Nora Webster, that child, that character who sees the world through the lens of a camera, and stammers.
Yeah, I mean that figure of Donal in Nora Webster is more or less a self-portrait, but I didn't have a camera, and I didn't do what he does with the photographs, smudging them and stuff. I have a friend who did that, whose way of dealing with the whole world was to get a camera as early as possible and to go around with it, but taking photographs of the oddest things,
Yeah.
That Donal is pretty much a self-portrait.
Yeah. He kind of saw the world through the camera lens, and you started to write poetry quite young.
Yeah, about 12. I would have, I wrote poetry, and I wrote poetry right through until about the age of 20. But writing poetry in Ireland is a dangerous business because there are so many good poets that if you were even a mediocre one, you'd be despised.
Yeah. And what was it? What was it, Colm, that had a child writing poetry? I'm interested in why that lens appealed to you.
It came on its own without a why, and it was something that would, every evening when I would be meant to be studying Latin or how to make methane gas or something I wasn't interested in, that I would just come, and a line would come and I would start, and it would keep me going for ages.
Mm.
Yeah.
And you managed. Some of them were published in a religious magazine. Is that right?
Yeah. There was a wonderful Capuchin magazine called Eirig, and it was for teenagers, and it was very good. It was literate, and it took you seriously, and it didn't just have a poetry corner. It had serious poems, and they wrote me serious letters about what I might do to a poem to improve it, and they were terribly nice, and. I discovered, to my absolute horror, that, of course, like all these institutions, they have a great archivist. And they kept everything from that time.
Right.
And they wrote to me about something to say that we have everything in some Capuchin archive. And it's so frightening.
Yeah. Growing up, you're and thinking of Donal and thinking of the character Donal and thinking about you. You've said that there was a lot of silence at home, that a lot of stuff that wasn't spoken about. Can you say something about that?
Yeah. My father died when I was 12, and it's very difficult for anyone to know how to handle that. I mean, not the funeral and not the immediate weeks, but what to do then, how much to mention him, how much not to. Whether you should get on with things, just get on with things, and leave all that behind. And if you do that, which is what people's tendency is, just to get on with things, then you create a sort of something funny in the wake of the silence. That it means that something becomes unmentionable, that feelings become unfelt. It isn't that the feelings become unmentionable. That's obvious, but that the feelings themselves don't actually get felt. And so you end up, it took me a long time to work that out as to what it was that had happened. And so it was a coping mechanism, and it served its purpose, but there's no right way of doing all that.
There's no,
The thing in itself is a disaster for that reason, in that it leaves behind all sorts of possibilities, none of which is right.
Yeah.
And so I was caught in the snare of that.
Yeah, yeah. That's, I think, such an important point, that there is no right way to do that, to grieve or to parent or to look after children.
Yeah.
When they've encountered probably their greatest fear, that a parent is gone, is no more.
That it isn't as though, you can't really blame anyone for doing anything, because the alternative was also difficult.
Yeah. Colm, did you get that? You've got to be the man of the house now. That we
to some extent, but it came ambiguously, because someone had to make the dinner, and it was in the middle of the day. It was Irish town, and my mother got a job, and she couldn't make the dinner. So I got out of Christian doctrine early. I was just at I think 12:15. I would stand up and just leave the class, and go home on my own in the house, age 12, and I would cook lunch. Lunch, it was never called lunch, it was dinner.
Yeah.
I would cook dinner, and my aunt would come, and my younger brother and my mother. When they all came, I would have everything ready for them, the table set, the whole thing out. Yeah, I did that. And,
did you really?
Yeah. So it wasn't just being the man of the house, it was being the woman of the house as well. It was lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That business of being in the kitchen with everyone coming, it's not a thing that many 12-year-olds get to feel, but it's got its own satisfactions, knowing that the potatoes will be boiled, and they will be ready exactly on time for when so-and-so comes.
Yeah.
And yes, it's the dreams of an everyday housewife.
It strikes me that in many ways, across the sweep of your work, you've really worked with or on those relationships that defy death. So relationships that don't die when someone dies. They outlive that relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Louise Gluck, we're talking at a time when Louise has just won the Nobel Prize, and she's someone who says, I write well about widows.
Yeah.
She has an essay about her work, and she's talking about that the idea of what's lost, living on, not just in memory, but in a much more palpable present way, and that being part of the dream of a novel, as in the dream of her poems, that separation between life and death, the past, the present, memory, and ordinary time, that those divisions can break down in a lovely way, even more in a poem, I think, but in a novel also, where it isn't just about haunting. Haunting would be the last thing I want. I hate haunting.
Yeah.
But the idea that somehow or other that the past is not past, and that the figures who have passed on have not passed on, and that so in the novel you're holding a sort of set of times that blur into one another as regards people's experience, even of the day, that the other parts of time will come in and out of that.
Yeah. That piece that the past is not the past. These relationships don't die with the death, but in fact continue to form and shape and make sense of her world.
There's a moment in Nora Webster where she's watching her mother in her last hours, or maybe even when she's laid out as dead, and she's seeing all of the faces. She's seeing elements in her mother of cousins, of aunts, of children, all sorts of people coming and going in those shadows, and it sort of speaks to her about the idea of that somehow she's witnessing a moment that isn't just this moment in time, but a whole lot of other things.
And the silence, and that can be that you grew up with, or that we can you unpack a silence, or you move very close to silence.
You see, what I'm talking about, it becomes a form of tact. It becomes almost a form of politeness, and that one is silent about many things that it doesn't do to discuss. So. I mean, I'm really not making this up, but it was terribly funny on the Late Late Show with Gay Byrne in those years. I'm talking about the 60s. Used to be on a Saturday night. And he never told you in advance who was coming on. And I had an aunt and uncle who came to visit on a Saturday night. And so my mother loved the Late Late Show, so she turned it on and everyone would watch it. My uncle disapproved of Gay Byrne. He thought he was a young pup. And then you'd never know who would come on. And people could come on and say anything they liked. And there was one night where Maura McEntee, the poet, came on with her husband. It was Conor Cruiser O'Brien, and they were both talking, and she just said how strange Ireland was in so many ways, and the way marriages were conducted. And she said there are many couples who have never, and she said it on the Late Late Show, I bet you could find it if you went back and looked, there are many couples who have never seen one another naked. Well, the idea. I mean, I scrolled down through the street, through our where we lived, and thought about some couples, and thought, I hope not. It would be unimaginable. In other words, that people wore their sexuality so carefully, and so the silence around just what people actually did, how human beings came into the world and stuff. Yeah. All of that was. Yeah. Just very politely put aside. I mean, it really couldn't be mentioned. But when she said it that night, it was such a frank thing to say. And I thought, well, why would they want? Like, wouldn't they be better? And all of us know that business of undressing and dressing in front of other, and the whole business, and dressing on the beach, for example, the modesty being preserved and stuff. So there was so much that wasn't mentioned for really good reason, that people just didn't want to talk about a lot of things, not just death, but sex, and perhaps a lot of other things too, including money. We didn't talk about money.
Death, sex, and money.
Yeah.
You're a James Baldwin fan, and go tell it on the mountain about that kind of growing up in a very religious culture. I mean, is that part of what you grew up in? I mean, a similar kind of... Tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, I don't feel it as a repressive religious culture. It didn't feel repressed or repressive. It opened up things a lot about, beauty. I mean, I'm talking about, well, boredom, first of all, the long, long sermons and the masses and the benediction and the confraternity and the sheer boredom. But it was very good because you got used to being bored. You thought that's what adults do to you, they bore you. And I remember Philip Larkin saying that he didn't know, he always thought he just hated everyone. But he just realized later that it was other children. But with me, it was adults. They were so boring, And when I read James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, I did recognize the sensuous way that he was handling religious feeling and religious belief, and the way in which almost the going to the church and the invoking the Almighty in the sky, and prayer and the Bible and the crucifixion and the redemption, all of it. I mean, I'm not suggesting it was sexual, although it almost is, but I'm saying it was sensual. Yeah. That he took it in via his body, and that it satisfied something in him. Yeah. And that's beautifully rendered in that book. And what's fascinating about Baldwin's own career is the way that he then wrote Giovanni's Room, a novel set among white homosexual people in Paris, and then realized, look, that's my family, the first book, my friends, the second book. And then In Another Country, the third novel, he tried to bring the two together, which is a fascinating idea. He tried to connect Harlem with Greenwich Village. And, with that trajectory of his is I think a fascinating one for anyone who's Irish or who's known Irish Catholicism. That mixture of the stained glass, the hymns, the incense, the prayers, as a sort of beauty, coming with a sort of set of restrictions and rules and rather frightening forms of punishment, including burning in hell for all eternity, which really, when you think about it, there's a recent novel by Marilyn Robinson where she thinks about hell. And Robinson is a serious Calvinist, and so I was interested in how she would view hell, but she doesn't. In the novel, it's not flames hell. It's a disheartened self-awareness.
A disheartened self-awareness.
That would be
Beautiful.
hell.
Wow.
In other words, you'd die and you'd realise you'd messed up completely. That you'd done horrible things, and so you would have. In eternity, you'd be really self-aware and you'd be disheartened.
Self-awareness.
Just disheartened. That sounded pretty grim to me.
Pretty grim.
Although I prefer it to flame, I prefer it to burn. I prefer it to burning for all eternity.
And Colm, that 10, 12, 14-year-old growing up in that kind of environment, growing up an emerging sexuality, how did it shape, inform, constrict or not? Well,
I think everyone who was gay then, and perhaps even to some extent still, is marked. And the mark is that you know something that you cannot say. And even if it only happens to somebody now, in our freedoms we have now, for 6 months or a year, it's still a mark. But for my generation, it lasted longer. Yeah. And you learned very quickly and very easily how to navigate, And, what you learned really was the night where you realized that two of your friends are staying on somewhere longer than they should because there are two girls over there. And whatever it is you're watching, you realize that impulse towards the girls is really keeping them going. And you want to just, why are we doing this? And you realize that that's actually, for them, the most important thing in the world just now. And you're out of that loop. And you're always going to be out of that loop. And so, yeah, it trains you in a sort of self-discipline that really is probably quite damaging.
So, yeah, Colm, that shaping, that silence that shapes, that silence the silence that kind of forms, particularly maybe the child who's growing up gay, the child who's growing up in an environment where he or she is different or unusual. It leaves its mark, yeah?
It leaves its mark, but I wouldn't dwell on it too much in the sense that I think for anyone, it's possible, and certainly was for me, to find a very comfortable place to be. Certainly in Dublin in those years, it might seem in retrospect like a conservative place or a difficult place to be, but it wasn't like that. That in other words, you found your friends and you created a cocoon for yourself, as everyone does in some way or other, and you put all that aside in a way and just got on with things. It wasn't a permanent business of feeling marked or feeling uncomfortable or feeling left out. That it just wasn't like that. Yeah. And when you think about it later, obviously the whole sense of repression organised by a number of people from the church and state was really quite severe. But it didn't feel like that on the night.
Right.
On the night when you're wondering, is there any chance that someone has a bottle of wine left over from some party in their flat, and you could go now and drink it. Yeah. Like, it's not thinking about, am I repressed? No, am I? And so it just wasn't like that.
So you came to UCD in 1972, and I think we're one of the first groups to be in Belfield, where UCD is now moved from here to there. So, and you found your community. I mean,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
think which is an experience for human beings. We find our tribe or we find our community. So it wasn't a time that was particularly lonely or.
No, I mean, UCD in 1972 was intellectually very stimulating, and if you had any interest in your subject, then whatever way it worked, they did something funny, and this both in history and in English. It was they didn't patronize you. They didn't see that you were just somebody coming from school age 17 and that you had to be spoken down to. So that really following them was challenging. And you realized you were being taken very seriously. And there were absolutely brilliant people involved. And to this day, you realize that extraordinary gift of how seriously the history department and the English department took undergraduates. And this isn't, I mean, in other institutions, people care about their graduate students much more, or they care about their own research, or they're too busy. But there wasn't that sense ever from people like Dennis Donoghue or Seamus Dean, or people like Fergus Darcy in the history department. It just wasn't like that, or Margaret McCurtain, that they were absolutely, totally engaged in whatever it was they were saying, and if you were any use at all, you responded to that.
Yeah, and I get the impression that you really like the classroom. You really like.
Yes, I do.
I really get
that.
Yes,
I really like the classroom.
Yeah, I get
that. That is that business of suddenly something new getting said that creates an excitement.
Yeah.
I mean, recently I had a student in Colombia, and I'd said to her, she's an undergraduate student, and I said to her, you should really go down to the Morgan Library and look at the Oscar Wilde papers. Since you're working on Wilde, you're doing this essay on Wilde, why don't I call someone at the Morgan and arrange for you to get into look at just, so you see his handwriting, just see the thing. And she came back up and said, I found something I haven't seen. Was it Wilde has a letter to an English editor saying, could you check this work for the wills and the shalls? Being Irish, I can never work out whether it should be will or shall. And it's Wilde saying he's an Irishman and his command, Wilde's meant at such command of English. He calls himself a lord of language. Yeah. Well, here he is with the usual Irish problem. It's like bring and take, will and shall. And she'd found this. And she came back up realizing, and she's of age and origin, that this was significant as an interesting thing that I had been talking about Wilde's outsiderness, not only as a sort of a sexual outlaw, but as an Irishman in London. Yeah. And they get excited. Yeah. Everyone in the class gets this. This is a piece of evidence. We really need this piece of evidence to show how insecure Wilde was, even with the English language. So I'm talking about that sort of moment, and sort of like all that.
Yeah. You when you were awarded the Penn Award, Mary Cloak, I think the director of the Arts Council, said that she described you as a champion of minorities. And I'm wondering about where that championing comes from. Tell me a little bit about that.
I wouldn't overdo that. I mean, it's important to remember that in the very early days of what we might call the gay liberation movement in Ireland, there were a number of very brave individuals, and I wasn't one of them, and that they really put themselves on the line, and so you wouldn't want to start taking credit for things that other people really should be. Okay. People like Tony Walsh, were really really out there, and
Colm, what was it what kept you back then?
I think the first thing is I'm not a natural crusader, and but the other thing was I just wasn't. I wouldn't have been comfortable at the time. That's simple as that. And I think everyone in the movement respected that there were people who didn't, people who did, and people who did sometimes, people who didn't other times. But there were marvellous people who did, I suppose David Norris being the main one, actually. But, And then there were others who didn't, and I was one of the others.
Your contribution many years later, your contribution to the marriage equality campaign, I remember as being significant. And if I'm right, you said that you really wanted the right to marry a partner in Enniscorthy. You mightn't want to do it, but your intervention at the time was very important.
It was a terribly interesting campaign. It was run with an extraordinary amount of care, and people like Brian Sheehan really put an extraordinary amount of thought into it. So I wrote a few speeches for politicians that I don't want, I wouldn't like to say who, but just trying to give them a tone that would really make people sit up and listen. And it was really to make it all personal, to make none of it political. Everything was about what your daughter would feel. What if your daughter... And I did a thing on the radio one morning, and it was an interesting campaign because the other side were not calling us names. It was not a bitter campaign in that sense. It was very mannerly, but Morning Ireland did stuff like that. You didn't get involved in a debate. They had someone from the other side talking for 7 minutes, and then you for 7 minutes, without the two of you having to even see each other. But it was just saying the question was trying to be as tentative as possible, not be certain, and to say, I don't understand how I can be used. I get, for example, if I'm in China, the embassy will come and there will be a dinner and I will be sort of forefronting some sort of idea about Ireland, that I could do that. But the basic right to have love recognised as ritual is something I cannot have. I'm left out of. Now, why is that? What is the problem? Why should that be? Why would it not be the other way around? And but also then there was a wonderful event at Trinity, where with a full hall of students. It was really a wonderful high moment where I got to talk about writers like John Broderick and Kate O'Brien, gay writers from the past, who had really had quite messed up lives, as well as having brilliant careers, but messed up lives because of their sexuality, and it ended badly for them in ways. And just trying to remember what it was they did and how they lived, but also just to look at the way in which, say, the Supreme Court, the Irish Supreme Court, in the Norris judgment, absolute idiot of it. So it's the most disgraceful judgment, Tom Higgins' judgment, using evidence that wasn't ever given to the court, throwing in his prejudices as judgment, and two judges concurring with him, and one of those judges later being made Chief Justice. And you realise, actually, the Supreme Court has a case to answer to this day on this, not just a dark moment, a moment of absolute asinine stupidity. It wasn't a single... And one of the other judges pointed this out at the time in his judgment, saying, that Judge Hensey pointed out that Tom Higgins' judgment had no basis it had never been presented to the court, had never been tested. So it was fun because you could go through their language forensically, and we just fell around laughing at the idea that these grown men paid this salary and called things like Chief Justice were such idiots.
And it was really where Europe came in, and the European Court of Human Rights. The European, Mary Robinson brought the case to Europe, and the European Court of Human Rights in 1988 declared, call on Ireland to change this. And the Irish case, it was a lovely thing. They said, we don't use the law. But, if this Protestant judges think you don't use the law, well, then change the law. We said, no, we don't change the law. And but anyway, it was changed in 1988, and then it took them a few years to actually do the thing. You to go back to the marriage equality referendum and the campaign, Colm, it being won on the back of story, essentially, and people's stories. What does the novel? What does the novel do for minorities, for those who are silenced, for those to advance human rights? Well, what can and has the novel
the
done?
only way I can answer that is by telling you a story that when I published my novel, The Story of the Night, which is really about a gay character, and I published that novel in 1996, and sometime afterwards I got a letter from Peter Sutherland, who had been the Attorney General, who was the European Commissioner, who was eventually head of World Trade, and was Goldman Sachs, was all those things. And the letter was said to me, I just didn't know that gay men felt love in the way you describe. I don't know how I thought it, but I thought that it was a physical thing. It was about just wanting to have sex with each other. But I didn't know it stretched into the romantic, into the emotional, and into, longing for somebody else's company or their phone call or their attention, someone of the same sex. I just didn't know until I read your novel. And I thought, wow, if Peter Sutherland doesn't know this, who else doesn't know this? Yeah. And also, maybe the only way he was ever going to find out was in a novel.
Yeah.
Maybe if you tried to debate with him, he wouldn't get it in the debate. But if you gave it a novel, I thought that it was an amazing moment for... and I think it happened with gay relationships, arising from what Adrian Rich said, that the gay people found it, because there were no images, that you looked in the mirror and there was no one in the glass. In other words, that you just didn't see yourself. If you were trying to start a relationship, you didn't have any way of working out what everyone else did. They had Romeo and Juliet. They had, they had everything to go with, And so a novel became, I think, in relationships, where you would get a David Levitt novel or an Edmund White novel or a James Baldwin novel, Jeanette Winterson novel, Emma Donoghue novel, and you would pass it between you. And that would become a way. A third person in the room was the book. And I think every gay couple knows this. I mean, it could also be a movie. It could also be a TV series. But it had to be something. You had to sit together and watch the gay movie or sit together and talk about the book. Yeah. And it wasn't nothing. It was about some idea... I don't know, I don't want to say identity building because it's a stupid thing to say, but I mean some idea of reinforcing emotions that were raw and there, but didn't have an objective quality. Yeah. So you couldn't see them as, therefore you couldn't trust them or know they were real. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the strangest idea. If you're gay.
Yeah, and such a powerful force. I mean, if you look at our history of censorship, such a powerful force to not give that image or to not give that mirror to look in. Yeah. Very, very powerful.
Yeah, I think people here understood very clearly. I mean, that books are dangerous. Yeah. And books are effective. Yeah. And they're much more effective than film because of this, that you read in silence and no one can see what you're thinking. Yeah. And it's just you and you and turning the page. And I think you can be transformed by a book. And that makes, it makes gay fiction very important.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a friend who, as a child, he used to sneak into the library in school and in the dictionary find the word homosexual and read it, to simply know that there were others out there.
Yeah.
So how powerful that is. Colm, can I ask you a little bit about lockdown? We're in some shape or form of it for quite some time now. We've talked about silence. You've talked about how your work comes out of silence, or silence and solitude playing a very important role in your writing and your work. What's it been like over the last kind of 6 or 8 months?
In America, it's very different to Ireland because it really became a battle between Democrats and Republicans rather than between the government or the people and the virus. Yeah. So, you actually felt that whatever was going on, it was not right, and that it was a terrible battle of egos, and there was a daily business of watching some outrage being committed by some governor or by the president, and very little sense been spoken by anybody. And so, you know, there are two areas in which America has, I think it's 1/20th of the world's population, but 1/5 of prisoners and 1/5 of coronavirus sufferers.
Wow.
You know, in other words, there are two areas where you can get that figure, 1/5, 1/20th. Yeah. You get people in prison and coronavirus. And so America is a big, brutal place, and it's not, you know, it's not well run in any way. And all the news from Ireland was the opposite. Now, I know things changed slightly in Ireland, but I'm talking about the first, say, 5 months, where you really did have a sort of extraordinary sense of social cohesion, of people of every generation, actually listening to the chief medical officer, listening to the Taoiseach, listening to the Minister of Health, and there was a sense of the country united against the virus, and the sort of level of trust of public officials was really extraordinary.
Yeah.
And so that's a fascinating thing to watch, the difference between Ireland and America.
Yeah.
But I think if you're a writer, you have a duty to shut up sometimes about you know, what you're going through, and that what you're going through is absolutely no interest. I mean, really, just none. And keep really quiet, because people have lost their jobs. You know, people are worrying. You know, that you know, the government seems to feel that they've done a wonderful job of just giving people some basic amount of money, whereas people have actually lost their jobs, and people and things are closing that might never open again.
When you had a pretty difficult year before that too. You'd a cancer diagnosis and really aggressive treatment. It was in 2009, 2018.
I did, yeah.
And I've worked in cancer care for many years, and I know it's often a time when the kind of big questions come up for people about meaning and contribution and those big existential kind of questions. Did that happen for you at all?
No, it didn't at all. No, really it didn't. I learned absolutely nothing from having cancer, except that I just need to get this over with so I could get on with things.
Yeah.
I think that most people really work out a lot of things for themselves in health. You know, in other words, it doesn't take sickness to make you think about what sort of relationships you want, or what sort of life you want, or what life means.
Yeah.
I think that people can do that in health much better, where they've got every option, and they've got time to laugh, and they've got, you know, leisure time, and they feel good, and that Ireland is good. There's a long winter, and the seasonal thing in Ireland is so wonderful. The big gaps between seasons. I think if you want to outline that, it takes a cancer diagnosis for you to actually wake up to the fact that you're, you know, who you are. I think there's to be something wrong with you to start with, you know. And so I remember lying there, and there was a lot of lying there, thinking, like, I just want this to be over. And when this is over, I'm going to go back to being exactly the same as I was before it started, in as many ways as I possibly can. But the idea that I had a road to Damascus, that halfway through the chemo, I suddenly found God or love or guilt, or I decided to change my life, that I was going to swim more or be kinder to dogs, or you know, adopt a cat, or devote my life to Mother Teresa. You know, I just actually, if everyone doesn't mind, I would like to get my taste back. And when I get it back, I'm going to eat what I ate before I lost it. I learned absolutely nothing about anything. Yeah. You know, other than what is interesting is that time passes. That's what time does. And something that seemed so enormous 2 years ago, that was just, this time 2 years ago, you should have seen me. I had no eyebrows. Not only, you know, this is still like, this is just like baby hair. It's still growing and stuff. Yeah. But I had no eyebrows, and I had no taste.
Yeah.
And I was probably skinny, and I probably looked really, really miserable. And I would shuffle along. And the biggest moment, and the moment that made me laugh most, was one day where I hailed a taxi. And when I got up close, when the taxi stopped and I got in close and he could see me, he drove off.
Really?
He was so frightened by the look.
It looked so awful.
Yeah, that he drove off. No, I thought this was, I thought it's the best story. I have a story now for the week. I have something, rather than telling people about some unfortunate side effect of this drug, I now have this wonderful story about being despised by the taxi drivers of Dublin. And I think he might have thought that I was a drug addict.
Right.
And I had some stuff from a pharmacy with me.
Okay.
In my hand, so he might have thought I was,
methadone.
Methadone. So to be fair to me, he might have thought I was going to cause havoc in his taxi, which was just so skinny and so weak that I just wanted to, go home.
Get me home.
And there was another day, which is pretty cool, where I decided I would go to the supermarket, and I really couldn't do that, but I got down to it, and then in the supermarket, I just literally, and I had to. It's like being an old lady. I had to ask for a chair. And they were so nice to me, brought me water. And eventually I got, out of the supermarket. I mean, they had to bring the basket up. They had to come back to tell me how much it was. They had to, and then I shuffled out like it was tremendous. And everyone looking for me. Poor man, look at him, on death's door. And I felt almost theatrical. But then the whole thing gave again on the bottom of Pembroke Street. I literally said, there was no chance that I could walk him. And so I looked at everybody really carefully. I thought, if one person turns me down, I'm not asking anybody else. I mean, this is just, So I looked at everyone. I studied everybody. And I saw this guy coming up the street. And he just looked really nice. And he turned out to be South African. And he was sort of cute, but he was also looked kind, and he looked competent. He looked like he could be an accountant or something, competent. And so I just said to him, look, I live up there, but I'm not really able to walk without falling over. I shouldn't be out at all, but could you just get me to my door up there? And then I don't want anything else. Like, I'm not looking for money, or I'm not looking for anything else from you. Just if you could just and he was terrible as he brought me to my door, and he told me maybe next time I go out, I should go out with somebody. So, I mean, some of it was just pure comedy.
The kindness of strangers.
And I needed the comedy, I needed all that.
Sure. How are you doing now?
I'm great.
You're well?
Good, yeah.
They're keeping an eye on you?
Yeah, it's keeping an eye on me, and I'm good, yeah.
The other kind of thread to your work that I'd like to maybe, if we could talk about briefly, is that of family. And I think what I kind of understand from your work is maybe the kind of ambivalent or the paradoxical that we need to separate from a family in order to become who we are, and we are ultimately drawn back to that in many ways, even if it is or has been a source of distress or tension. Something about that kind of paradox and hold that family have on us. Is that?
Yeah, you see, I think it's a very good subject for a novel, because it's novels are very good about areas of conflict which are very difficult to define. So that idea of belonging somewhere, that somewhere you can always go back to, even in memory, that you have this basic thing that has to do with blood, with early affection, with associations and ties that you can really not easily sunder or cut. And then you're out in the world where you've made many choices, and you've drifted into things. I mean, you don't drift into a family, you're born into a family, but you drift into friendships, and you drift into love affairs, and you drift into relationships. In other words, you don't know at the beginning, things are always tentative. But that's not how family begins. Family begins in exactly the opposite way.
Yeah.
So you've got two ways in which your world has been made for you. One casual and the other deliberate.
Yeah.
And then you have to work all that out. I think in a novel where if the family part becomes difficult, you see, if the friendship or love part becomes difficult, that's a simple thing. You just can drift away from people, or the relationship could break up. But with family, if that happens, it's a much more fraught and long-term problem and difficulty. So that in a novel, you can work with that. You can get a lot of energy from that.
Yeah. And you've been, to my mind at least, you've been you've been really keen or very careful about not sanitizing any of that the nuance, the brokenness, the fragility of family and of parenting.
Yeah, I mean, I think in fiction you have a duty to be unsparing, that if you decide this is too hard, and then you should do some other job, that in other words, you actually need to go very tough, be very tough, and if something is difficult to define, then that's where you need to be. And therefore you need to find images, and the images need to be as tough as possible. And certainly not, you mustn't soften anything, because that's really, the novel's job is not to offer comfort, easy comfort, but to offer another sort of comfort, which is the result of things being clearly defined and being explicitly managed.
You wrote Nora Webster over a long period of time, I think 12 or maybe 14 years, and in a kind of a low key, regular, unfinished off kind of a way, almost an antidote to that, the self as a self-improvement project that we'll kind of finish and wrap things up quite nicely. Can you say something about that?
I mean, it was a long time after these things had happened. So I had all the years to think about them. And I came to no good conclusion. So all I had were images. And then it was a question of finding focus. And by finding the focus was by concentrating on the mother rather than the child. In other words, it's very, very difficult to write a novel from the point of view of a 12 or 13-year-old. You can write a short story from that point of view. But to get a full novel, there's almost not enough felt life or sensibility within things are too raw and unformed. So by moving, it was almost something writing novels is strange. You often get a sudden idea in a flash when you least expect it. Something comes to you, move it to the mother. Concentrate on her rather than the children, so that build it from her side as she's tentatively exploring what the world will be like in the future. So it isn't just what she's doing now is significant for her, is that this is an act. This is the beginning of what life will be like, so that each time she moves out, it has an extra aura attached to it, which is that, she's not just in a pub. She's thinking, this is what I will be like. When I want to go home, I can go home at any time. I don't have to find where my husband is.
Yeah.
And therefore that act has a second time frame attached to it.
Yeah.
And so you're working with that. And also, the thing is not to exaggerate. The main thing, really, in both life and fiction, is that emotion should not exceed its cause. And so therefore, don't have her grief-stricken crying all the time. Have it coming unexpectedly in funny ways. Have her coping more than crying, but not have her coping too much either.
Yeah.
So you're constantly involved in a sort of balancing act with colors, as though if you put too much black here, people just say, yeah, we know that already. So you've got to surprise us with something else. And so, I mean, in other words, her relationship to the children is often cold, often unfeeling, but then it suddenly isn't. Or she just isn't sure. She doesn't think about the children except that they're being fed and they're warm or something, but she doesn't know that they're suffering like she is. But then suddenly she does. So you've got to always work with the opposite as well as with the, so you have a sort of dominant way of approaching a scene.
Yeah.
And then underneath the dominant, you bring in as though a sort of jarring note.
And that kind of piece, Colm, about the first family, the family that we don't choose, and how later on in life we find a second family, but the first family, and I think sometimes how difficult that can be for someone who's growing up in an environment where they don't fit into that. So many LGBTI people, for example, might really struggle with the first family. And we've seen that in Blackwater Lighthouse. I think the piece is there about the kind of wider cultural piece. So been drawn back to the first family in a way that's messy and that's broken is another piece that I read in your work.
With the Blackwater Lightship, I felt that that idea of going home. Of course, home is the most fraught and difficult place for him. It's probably where he shouldn't go, but it's what he wants to do. And there's a moment towards the end of the book where, he's lying in his mother's arms, and one of his friends just says, "That's what he's wanted to do for so long." And the guys are so, it's a slightly unfair book in a way, because the gay guys in the book are so wise. One of them is so wise, like he's like a Greek chorus. There's nothing that he hasn't foreseen, and he can blame, he can hand out blame. He's a real little moralist of a guy, and he's really irritating, But he nonetheless has been managing this very difficult business where this guy who just is afraid to go home, but if he does, he has to go home. And so the novel treats that business of, he replaced his family with his friends. So his friends became his family. And then he wanted his family back. And his friends almost feel sometimes in those 6 days that they're really not wanted. But the grandmother says to them at some point, "Could you all just get out of here? This is us. We're his world." And one of them has to say, "Well, I'm sorry you weren't there. Like, I don't know what you're talking about." And so that argument goes on between this very moralistic, clean-living gay guy who's just so, and the grandmother at each other over this whole question of who owns him now. Who does he belong to? As a sort of tug of war going on.
So that kind of collision of the first and second family, and then the kind of hierarchy that can take place then around someone's illness or at the end of someone's life.
Who is the prime carer? And I think this is one of the great subjects in the gay world, is just what happened with the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, where all these guys who had been living hedonistically or just having a really good time, suddenly became carers, suddenly became buddies, suddenly formed groups around somebody. So the level of care and sympathy. Gay guys became nice guys. And, this was an extraordinary phenomenon that I think that our world wasn't merely changed by the epidemic. It was changed as well by the response to the epidemic. And while the epidemic was an absolute disaster. It could not. I think like it was a plague, but the actual stories within the plague are ones that I think maybe still even need to be told.
So, Colm, you started to write poetry as a child, and you continue to write. Has the reason changed?
I've been writing poetry recently. No one needs more poems. And if they do, they want them to be by Paul Muldoon or Maeve McGuckian or, Paula Meehan. Like, they really don't want poems by me. Like, they just don't want them. And you realise at night, nobody wants this. And therefore, the impulse remains, but you almost think, look, and also, if a friendship would not survive long if you sent the friend constantly the poems you've been writing. So, it is really something you have to be very, very careful with. That it's, I'll give you an example. Years ago, I went to Tunis to interview Yasser Arafat, and there was a lot of drama around going to his place, and the interviews were long. I did one on a Thursday and a second one on a Saturday. And, he was armed. There were a lot of armed people around. This was a very important time because it was just before Oslo, and he was beginning to want world publicity, suggested he was a man of peace. And I write all this for this magazine, for Esquire, I was working for at the time, and I wrote it for Esquire, and it was all over. But in my memory, when I think about it, and I think there's a difference between, say, a poem and an article in a magazine, is the poem might tell the truth in a way that the article in the magazine has to pose. You have to pose as a concerned person about the Golan Heights, the PLO, the Mossad. Whereas actually, when you remember it, that there was an anteroom before going into Arafat's office, and there were about 12 bodyguards, And they were all in leather jackets and tight jeans, and they were all young, and they were all pretty fit, and they were all standing around looking at me. And I was really quite fraught. I mean, it was quite, like, you know where to look. And if you caught one of their eyes, like you really, it wasn't as though they were going to attack you or do anything, but no, I wasn't sure how, it looked sexual. I mean, it felt all about sex to me. And I couldn't believe it, you know. They were all gorgeous, and they were all, and Arafat, anyway, that's a poem. You know, in other words, that moment of, and if you gazed for too long, the guy would just look away. It wouldn't be look away in dislike. It was just boredom. Like they just like it wasn't as though they were coming on to you or you to them. If you know, they were just there. But nonetheless, it was a moment. You know, and that's a poem where you know you actually got to tell the truth about what happened that day in Arafat's place. Okay, all the other stuff is passed on. This remains an emotion, a memory, and something also interesting. It's another thing about poetry that maybe a poem has to be interesting in a way. And you think, is this poem interesting? And you think, well, if it's not interesting, like, don't write it in that case. You know, try and see if this is interesting.
So what are you writing? What are you writing? What are your poems about?
Don't encourage me, but I've been working on these poems. Say, part of a poem's job maybe is to look at the world in a new way. So that, say, I have a poem about the day when the votes were being counted in the gay marriage referendum, where two guys, these are two completely fictional guys in their 60s who've been gay all along, been known all the gay places in Dublin for the previous 40 years. And they meet up and they have lunch somewhere, and then somewhere in Phibsborough, and then they walk into town, and then they go up to Dublin Castle. But they, as usual, they just think there are too many young gay guys. It's just like somehow or other the ageist thing has really caught on in the gay world, and especially in the homosexual, you know, the male homosexual one. And there are all these gay guys with nice haircuts, and you know they look really trendy, and they just don't feel they belong, and they feel it's just a new world, and that they're too old to deal with it. And they decide they would like to go and visit. This is in the poem. All the places that they knew in all the years, the gay places in Dublin that have disappeared. So they go to pass by saunas that were really all the rage in the 80s, or Bartley Duns that was all the rage in the 60s, that Rice's was all the rage in the 70s, that, you know, they discuss various public bathrooms that they used to know, some parks, Palmerston Park, Phoenix Park, that were part of that deal, the Hirschfeld Centre within Temple Bar. So they just do a sort of tour, sometimes just talking, and they make jokes like that, for them, same sex. Same sex? When did that start, the phrase same sex? Because they said, you know, years ago, same sex would be if you had too much of the same sort of sex. You'd want novelty, so you might go to a park, or you go to a bar, you go to a public toilet, or you go to a, you know, like, that's what same sex used to be. Now same sex. And now the Taoiseach is talking about same sex. And so the words have changed. So they just go through, not nostalgically, but just that this is the world they have known. This is the world that is now, with this Saturday, the votes are being counted, that whole world that they're talking about, of sort of furtive places to be, will dissolve. That the memory of those places will go. It's the sort of thing that George Chauncey, who works at Columbia as well, he's an historian of gay New York. And it's all about those dotted lines, suggesting that down that street there was a place to the right, and it lasted 3 years, and it did, you know, people, you know, he's doing all that work for New York. And in the poem, I'm trying to do all, just in a, you know, I'm trying to do all the work for Dublin, just to say, this is where. Yeah. But the two guys eventually they walk back towards Dublin Castle, and they said, fuck it, we're just going home. You know, and they just they said they're going to take the slow way home, because that's not their world, that they're, you know, that they live in a, that day suggested a sort of end of history and the beginning of a thing called the future. And I just wanted to register the fact that there were a lot of echoes, shadows, clues and dotted lines going back into a Dublin of the, of a much more repressed time, but it didn't feel repressed on some of those nights.
Yeah, and that idea that that poetry can tell a truth, it can get to a truth and tell a different story, seems to be part of that too.
Yeah, if you're sitting up at night writing something that no one wants, you might as well make it true and good, because as well as doing something completely useless and unwanted, telling lies, being dishonest within that would be, I think, a treble sort of way of really wasting everyone's time.
So, Colm, a very big thank you on behalf of UCD, my colleagues in Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, and our friends and colleagues here at MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland. We really appreciate your time and your generosity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For me, literature, for me, writers, for me, the arts, in some ways, capture what's often missed in conversation, what's often missed historically when it comes to the lives of people who, for various reasons in this country and beyond, don't experience an equal world, a world that is accommodating, is embracing of diversity, and certainly a world that isn't inclusive. So I feel the arts and literature play a very, very central and important role in advocating for a more equal, a more just, a more diverse and inclusive society.
You've been listening to a podcast from RadioMoLI, which broadcasts from MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland. If you've enjoyed this programme, do consider becoming a MoLI member or giving membership to a friend. It's the best way to support the museum and its programming. Visit moli.ie/membership to find out more. Thank you for listening.